Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Future of Privacy Forum's LinkedIn Live. My name is Tatiana Rice. I'm the Senior Director here. Uh, I am so pleased to be able to announce the second annual report of our State of AI report focusing on the state legislative trends. I'm really pleased to be joined here by my colleagues on the legislation team, Justine Gluck and Beth Doe. The overall, of course, goal of the report is to be able to identify some of the key trends that we saw in what we call kind of industry obligation artificial intelligence bills. So these are bills that are really focused on any types of compliance obligations that could be either direct or indirect. And this really does fit into our general legislation team goals, where we're trying to really understand the compliance landscape, how all the different puzzle pieces fit together, and at a trend level, what folks should be thinking about and how to think about the landscape. So of course, I will jump in with questions for some of the main authors here, but I'll just give a quick overview of how this report was structured and put together. We did apply a pretty fairly nuanced and targeted methodology in this. You'll notice that the bills that we tracked were closer to the 210 number in 42 states rather than some larger numbers that you might see in other trackers. And the reason for that is the fact that, again, we do focus on bills that are applying some level of a direct or indirect industry obligation on the private sector's AI development or deployment. So in that kind of 210 bill mark, we watched about 12 that were signed into law and 8 of which are awaiting governor action. And so some of those include things like Maine's chatbot law, the Illinois AI and therapy law, the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act, and of course the new SB 53 coming out of California. A lot of the other bills that are awaiting governor action are still in California and New York. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you both to maybe quickly introduce yourselves and explain the methodology of bills considered in this report and how you all thought about making sense of the landscape, because it is so complex and there was so much going on this year. I'm sure the audience would really love to hear about how you all thought about this.
Yeah, I'll jump on in. So hi, I'm Justine. I'm on the U.S. legislation team here at FPF. I'll just reiterate kind of how Tatiana described our tracking and analysis methodology. So again, we tracked 210 bills across 42 states this year. And we've seen other legislative trackers estimate that perhaps there's more like 1,000 bills out there. But again, our report is applying a more targeted methodology that's focusing specifically on those measures likely to influence industry practices and the compliance landscape. So, for example, we don't touch bills that merely reference AI in passing or pass resolutions that don't hold legal authority. We don't focus on legislation areas like elections or housing or agriculture. So again, those are all use cases that are less likely to involve direct obligations for companies that are developing or deploying AI. And I'll let Beth speak a little bit to how we categorize the different bills that we did track.
Hello, everyone. My name is Beth Doe. I have the distinct pleasure of getting to work with both Tatiana and Justine. And as they've talked about before, this has been a huge labor of love. And so we're excited to present it to you. We're excited that it's out in the world. But as Justine mentioned, I'll just really quickly go over some of how we approached the categories. So we have 4 main categories. We'll focus on 3 of them for now. So the first one is use or context specific bills. So here in this category, we focused on certain uses of AI in high risk decision making or context. For example, healthcare, employment, finance, etc. We've also looked at, this typically focuses on applications where AI may significantly impact individuals' rights or access to services or economic opportunities. The second category is tech specific. So in the technology specific category, we focused on specific AI technologies such as generative AI, frontier foundation models, and chatbots. These bills tend to tailor requirements to the functionality and the capabilities or use patterns of these technologies. Third, we focused on liability and accountability. So this is a little bit of a different category than the first two, which are pretty self-explanatory. So here in this section, we focused on defining, clarifying, or qualifying legal responsibilities and for the use and development of AI systems, such as establishing liability standards or affirmative defenses or authorizing or like creating new innovation initiatives such as regulatory sandboxes, which have been quite popular as of late. So these bills tend to focus on accountability, responsible innovation, and greater legal clarity. The fourth section, which we won't get into so much today, is government use and strategy. These bills tend constitute roughly 30% of the bills that we're tracking or so, and they focus on requirements for how government agencies use AI, and our particular interest is like their focus on the downstream or the indirect effects of AI on the private sector, such as creating standards or requirements or guidance for agencies procuring AI systems from private sector vendors. And with that, I will turn it back to Tatiana.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that last point is also really interesting. And I know all of us have talked really extensively about how do we figure out the kind of like government use bills to track, the ones that do have kind of these downstream procurement requirements that are important and create standards for industry versus those that don't have those kind of indirect effects. And I think tracking those are still really important for the procurement, but in terms of the report, the substance of the report, we really do focus on, those first three categories of the use or context specific, the technology specific, and this new like liability and accountability approach. And so I think in those three buckets, it sounds like what we've seen a lot in the landscape is that, and this is highlighted in our first key takeaway, that a lot of lawmakers and a lot of the enacted laws moved away from some of the more sweeping frameworks towards more narrow, transparency-driven approaches. Obviously, there was a lot of issues in some of the broader frameworks that were moving this past year or were trying to get movement, such as the Virginia bill, the Colorado AI Act's revisions, California AB 1018 was moved to a 2-year bill. Texas's TREGA moved from what was much more comprehensive to a more narrow, mostly focusing on government use, but a few private sector requirements. So really interesting to see that. But I'm wondering, Justine, would you mind giving a little bit more specific, concrete examples about how this played out in the laws that were enacted, and what do you think this is the result from?
Yeah, so as you alluded, we did not see any like standalone comprehensive law get passed in 2025 on AI in the States. This is obviously different from last year. We saw Colorado and discussion on bills in Connecticut that were more comprehensive. And I think this is really emphasizing how lawmakers are thinking about AI a bit differently. Specifically, its focus on specific sectors and types of technology, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later in our discussion, and choosing to think and introduce more targeted bills focused on those areas. And when we think about bills that have been enacted this year, we are seeing a trend of bills that were either passed last year, or were returning from last session and didn't get passed, being narrowed in 2025. So I think that's a real big trend in the bills that we've tracked this year. For example, we have the Utah AI Policy Act that was passed last year in a previous session. That bill would require entities that are using generative AI in certain like regulated professions, like for example, psychologists, to disclose that they're interacting with Gen AI and not a human. This year, Utah passed a bill, SB 226, that amended this law to narrow its scope. So to require disclosure requirements in instances that are only high risk. So that's just one example of kind of that trend that Tatiana was alluding to. We see a similar narrowing when we think about SB 53, the bill that was just signed by Governor Newsom this week. That bill is a second attempt at regulation on frontier and foundation models in California. Last year, it was introduced as SB 1047, was ultimately vetoed by Governor Newsom, and there were several requirements in that bill that we don't see carried over to its 2025 version. So just briefly, for example, that bill would have required annual audits by third-party assessors. It would have required developers to have full shutdown capabilities or like kill switches built into their models, shorter windows, higher penalties. things like that. And we see the version of the bill that passed this year eliminating a lot of those requirements. I'll just end by briefly saying that in general, we just saw a large increase in bills that focused on user-facing disclosures as their primary safeguard. So again, opposed to more detailed or maybe more substantive requirements like an audit, those disclosures were more and more prevalent in AI bills as like the primary mechanism.
Yeah, and I know in the report we talk about a little bit whether this move towards transparency may be a few different factors. One, it could be a new version of a quote unquote notice and choice regime, which those who have been in data privacy for a while, know that this has been tested and this has been an initial framework in data privacy law for a long time. And now we're starting to shift away from that in data privacy, maybe starting there in AI right now. The other second is just generally the developments that are happening at the federal level, the international level, and with industry. So really interesting to see that shift in just a year's capacity. I think one of the other areas that's been really interesting to watch is this user context specific approach. I think a lot of people tend to group all AI legislation in one bucket, but there are such different approaches to how lawmakers think about them. And the fact that the user context specific approach typically tends to be the most significant approach or the one with the most activity, I think makes a lot of sense to me in terms of focusing on the most high risk areas where AI is used, right? Not just regulating AI in itself, but how AI is used in certain contexts. So for the context or specific approach, we've seen a lot of activity specifically in the kind of quote unquote healthcare space. And I'd be remiss not to point out that my colleague Jordan Wrigley, who does a lot of our health work, reminds us that that means a lot of different things. That could mean AI in the clinical context, AI in the consumer health context, HIPAA versus non-HIPAA entities. So Beth, can you help us understand this a little bit more? Can you highlight some of the key laws that were passed this year, their particular context and applications, and whether there are any implications beyond the healthcare sector?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think healthcare has been particularly interesting. It's been in the news a lot, lots of hearings, lots of cases, particularly around chatbots, therapy chatbots. I think some of those laws are kind of good examples of what you're talking about. So I will say, like, just broadly speaking, this year we haven't seen a lot of we haven't seen like standalone high-risk ADMT frameworks, but rather we've been seeing much more targeted things, and healthcare is a good example of that. So particularly around disclosure, so like Utah's SB 452, where like a user-facing disclosure is the most common safeguard. So for Utah's bill, like this is a targeted law concerning mental health chatbots, requiring suppliers to clearly and conspicuously notify users before an interaction that they're interacting with an AI technology. And then kind of more broadly speaking, we've seen a number of laws focus on health-related AI applications, like you just said. So legislators concentrated on AI, particularly in the sensitive health context. And our colleague Jordan Wrigley has definitely been thinking a lot about this issue over the last year or two alone, and for years before then as well. But in AI, we're looking at it particularly in the context of mental health and companion chatbots, which often require disclosure obligations. So 4 of the enacted laws in 2025 that we were tracking have directly focused on specific aspects of healthcare. So whereas a couple others, Connecticut's SB 1295 and Utah's SB 149, have adopted kind of broader frameworks that look at AI systems used in healthcare settings. But you also asked about, like laws that have implications beyond healthcare. I think a good example of that would be Illinois' HB 1808, which has 1806, which is close to the number I kept saying, which has potentially like vague applications for general LLM providers. So 1806 offers one of the more detailed compliance frameworks, barring licensed therapy professionals from using AI for anything beyond defined like supplementary support functions. So this requirement would create new compliance obligations for providers to track how AI is deployed in clinical settings, and then also ensuring that they're also formally documenting these practices. So providers will need to maintain records of consent and AI use as a practical safeguard, which raises potential implications beyond the healthcare space.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. That particular law, I think that provision regarding prohibition of AI in therapeutic services is really fascinating, and could go a lot of different ways depending on the kind of legal interpretation. But I do want to move on to our technology specific approach. And Beth, you already kind of alluded to this a little bit. Chatbots are the thing. Chatbots have been a clear area of legislative focus, not only in the States, but on the Hill. We anticipate that this is going to continue into 2026. So, Justine, I know you've been paying a lot of attention to this area. Can you highlight some of the key chatbot laws that were passed this year and why you think the area became so prevalent, and what are some of the key components of those laws?
Yeah. So as Tatiana mentioned, in 2024, we actually didn't see states passing any legislation that was specifically scoped to apply to chatbots. And that was definitely not the case in 2025. This year, we saw 7 chatbot bills pass at least like one chamber of their legislature, with 5 of them enacted, some of which are awaiting signature still in California. But that's obviously a really significant increase in interest. I'll list some of the chatbot bills at the end, but I'll dive into just a little bit more about them first. And yeah, we can point to, I think, several reasons for the increase in interest in this topic. I think one of the primary reasons has been, unfortunately, the multiple lawsuits that have emerged this past year on the topic of companion chatbots and youth health and safety. So companion chatbots, for those who might not be familiar, are those chatbots that are specifically designed to simulate empathetic conversations and build emotional relationships with their users. And in states from Utah to Florida to Texas, there are unfortunately several devastating cases of chatbots allegedly encouraging suicidal ideation for youth users. And we've, as Tatiana mentioned, seen hearings on the Congress in the last couple months on this topic, and evidently interest in the state level to pass bills regulating chatbots, and some very specifically to regulate these companion chatbots. And yeah, I'll just highlight maybe some of the key components that we're seeing throughout some of these bills that have passed this year. So 6 of the 7 bills I mentioned focus specifically on disclosure requirements as the central theme of the bill. So typically that means that chatbot operators are required to clearly and conspicuously notify users that the chatbot they're talking to is not human. Different bills offer different timelines for that notice. For example, a bill that's pending in California, SB 243, would require reminders every 3 hours during usage, but that's specifically scoped for minors that are using the chatbot. Another key theme of these bills, some of them were safety-focused provision, again, specifically around suicide risk and self-harm. We see legislation in New York that passed as part of their budget bill that would require AI companions to direct users to crisis resources when the users are expressing, again, suicidal ideation. So that's been a theme that is present both in New York bills and California bills. We also have bills like Utah's SB 452 that are focused specifically on mental health chatbots. So these are chatbots that would play a role similar to a licensed mental health care professional, not necessarily companion chatbots, which are a bit different. And bills like this Utah bill are focused on regulating those type of technologies. A couple other bills just worth mentioning quickly for folks who are paying attention to chatbots. We have California AB 1064, which is again awaiting governor's signature. That's another companion chatbot bill that is focused specifically on children. So operators of chatbots would be prohibited from making a companion chatbot available to a child if that chatbot is capable of doing a specific harm. So offering mental health therapy is one of those harms, similar to that Utah bill, also encouraging violence or self-harm. So we have that bill. There's a chatbot bill that has passed in Maine, New York, as I've mentioned. So several states are interested in this topic.
Yeah, I will say it now, and I know us three have said this many times. Next year certainly will be chatbot city for, I think, all states. Particularly, I think what we're going to be seeing is a lot of these youth issues come on into the AI space in the chatbot context. And I think something that's top of mind for me and a lot of us who are in the privacy community are, if these laws are trying to ensure a level of safety for kids who are using these systems, like how much of this sensitive inferential data are you requiring companies to do? Are you trying to make sure that companies are inferring kind of sensitive health information about kids and for them to be able to be safe? And like, what are the trade-offs of those things, right? And so I think that is an area where we're going to continue to think about and ideate on to make sure that we're kind of properly balancing privacy and these youth safety concerns. But last approach that we highlight in the report is a new approach, actually, which we did not discuss in our last year's report, what we're calling the liability and accountability approach. And so, as I think was mentioned earlier, those are the approaches that focus on defining, clarifying, or qualifying legal responsibility for use and deployment of AI systems. And this one is a little bit different from the other two, where use is obviously focusing on AI use, technology is focusing on the particular technology. This one is focusing kind of on existing legal tools, which I think is fascinating. So, Beth, can you give us a few like concrete examples of laws that fit this newer framework, where this approach may have come from, and kind of what are the kind of key trends that we saw?
Yeah, I will try to answer those questions distinctly not in order. So I think to your question about like where this came from, there's been a lot of question around like AI liability, right? Like who is responsible? Who should be held accountable? Is it the developer? Is it the deployer? Is it someone else? Like a new term that, different states are trying to figure out. We'll talk about this a little more later, but there's still just a lot of uncertainty and AI continues to evolve. And I think lawmakers are really cognizant of that. And they want to balance, like regulation, but also supporting innovation. And I think the tension between those two desires is kind of the backbone of this section. So with that context, I think I'm going to come back to Utah's HB 452. Not that we have favorite bills, but there are definitely certain bills we see time and time again, and this is one of them. Just because it's a bill that like has come up in the context of healthcare and chatbots and liability. And so under Utah's HB 452 again, which is their mental health chatbot law, it would allow an affirmative defense if a provider maintains a certain AI governance series of measures. And then in contrast to that, like look at California's SB 813, which took a more like model approach by allowing AI developers to use certified third-party audits as an affirmative defense in civil lawsuits. And then in addition, we talked a little, or Tatiana, you spoke a little about like some of the trends and kind of broader. And so I think it's also important to think about how several state legislators are also drawing inspiration from federal priorities. So we're seeing, under kind of, or in response to, or like taking into context the White House's America AI Action Plan, which was released July this past year, which emphasized fostering innovation while reducing regulatory barriers. So for example, we've seen under that the White House plans like Pillar 1, which focuses on accelerating AI innovation. It explicitly recommends establishing regulatory sandboxes. And so you're seeing that trend reflected in Utah and Texas and Delaware. Utah has an established AI regulatory sandbox at this point. The last year focused on mental health chatbots. Texas and Delaware are kind of a little in the process of developing their sandboxes currently. And so these are ways that lawmakers are kind of testing out how to use, like how to have a controlled experimentation space and balance that with oversight. And I'll just kind of stop there, cognizant of time.
All good. And I will ask maybe Adrian or somebody, FPF, to drop the regulatory sandbox blog in the chat, because I do think that has been another very large area where we've seen a lot of activity, both on the state and federal level. And Beth, I know you and Stacy on the AI Center have done a lot of digging kind of intentionally about how do these function? They look very different when we're looking at some of the state level approaches versus what we've seen internationally. So I think that's something for folks to really look into as I think it continues to gain traction. The last part of this report might be the one that's most interesting to folks and they want to hear more on, which is, of course, what are the areas to be looking forward to or looking for in 2026? So some of the areas that we identify in this report include definitional uncertainty, agentic AI, algorithmic pricing. Can you both just explain what those mean in practice for us to be looking out for?
Sure. Yeah, I'll dive into what we mean by definitional uncertainty. So, in the report we talk about, we coin definitional uncertainty across the state AI legislative landscape, which means that we are continuing to see variations in how AI related terminology is being defined. We point specifically in the report to the terms artificial intelligence itself, frontier and foundation models, generative AI, and chatbots. And as we see states like increasingly enact AI legislation, we see those definitional differences as being really consequential, especially for compliance purposes and thinking about complying across state lines and state borders. I'm conscious of time, but just really briefly, I'll give an example of what that might mean for chatbots. So, for example, we see a lot of repetition in the chatbot definitions for certain words like simulate and sustain and human-like to define what a chatbot is. But other bills take different approaches that maybe scope more technologies or less technologies into their definition. So, like, for example, New York specifies that companion chatbots must ask unprompted or unsolicited emotion-based questions, which is a more unique qualifier. So that's just one example of what we mean when we talk about definitional uncertainty.
Yeah, and I'll talk about some of the other big trends that we're expecting more of in 2026. So we've been looking at agentic AI, and one of our colleagues, Daniel Barrick, has done a lot of work in this space along with Stacey Gray. We're just seeing a lot of governments interested in this. So agentic AI, or the use of AI agents, has been a big buzzword, especially in the last few months. So in Virginia, the governor has launched the nation's first agentic AI regulatory reduction pilot to kind of assess how to think about using agentic AI to reduce regulatory burdens on state agencies. You're also probably seeing a number of AI chatbots on state websites and other websites. Whenever you try to figure out what's wrong with your flight delay, you're probably talking to an AI chatbot. So you're going to see not only the growth of AI chatbots, but also agentic AI imbued in those chatbots. And so just a proliferation of different AI technologies, particularly in the agentic and chatbot space. And then second, we're looking at algorithmic pricing or data-based pricing. And our colleagues, Jameson Spivak and Jordan Francis, have looked into this as well. And all of this you can find on our website, or you can just Google or put into your favorite, chat, companion thing, find this for me. But in terms of algorithmic pricing, we're seeing a number of states looking at bills that seek to regulate algorithmic pricing practices, focusing on issues around discrimination and transparency and consumer protection. With that thought, I'll turn it back to you, Tatiana.
Cool. Well, thank you. So I have one last question for you both. We have been watching this space for a very long time at this point because of, a lot of things that are happening in the environment and the world. We maybe haven't been as much of an active participant, but we have watched very closely everything that's happening and dug deep into everything that is happening. So question for you both, in really putting everything that we've thought about over the past 6 months into a detailed report, what did you find to be most surprising or counterintuitive insight that you thought you came across in putting this together?
I'll go quick. I think what I find super interesting is we have one graph where you can see all the different issues that we've covered, and there are so many issues. And we talk about this in the report, how there aren't huge trends. It would be easy and convenient for us to say, here is the trend for 2025, and the report could be 2 pages instead of 20. But the reason it's so long, and because there are so many different ways that people are thinking about AI technologies, and so many different ways, and it constantly evolves. So it's really hard it feels like a very, like a slippery snake, or some animal metaphor that I'm incapable of putting together. Justine, what do you think?
Yeah, I think my answer is pretty similar to yours. Something that is always really striking to me is how fast AI as a technology moves and how quickly legislation tends to follow that. We brought chatbots up so often in this call, but I think that's a great example. That really wasn't the focus of a lot of legislation even last year, and look how quickly that's become a topic of interest as the technology itself has evolved and changed. So watching that kind of mirroring is always really interesting to me when we look at these bills.
Cool. Well, thank you both again so much for joining. Thanks to Comms and all of the FPF folks who really came together to put this on. It's been really insightful to be able to work through. If anybody in the audience has any questions, feedback, anything that you're looking to engage on, please feel free to either reach out to us directly. My email is trice@fpf.org. As well as putting things in the comments or looking at our report directly on the blog. So don't forget to check out the supplement as well. That is really interesting work by our intern from this past summer, who was both a law student and a data scientist. She's incredible. Put together a lot of these graphs that really show the data science behind this report, and I'm really proud of it. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.